And so now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our masterclass speaker, Professor John Dedowski. Just a moment here. Yes, Professor Dedowski is a full professor in systematic theology at Regis College in Toronto. He's a dedicated teacher and prolific author of just a few of The Structure of Religious Knowing, The Eclipse and Recovery of Beauty, and Image to Insight. He's authored numerous articles in the areas of systematic theology, philosophy, and religious studies. He's co-edited 3 volumes of Bernard Lonergan's collected works, a second collection, third collection, Method in Theology. Among other honors, he was visiting professor of Catholic Studies at the University of New Mexico. He was also introduced into the prestigious American Theology Society, which meets annually at Princeton. He serves as the treasurer of the board of the Catholic Theological Society of America, the largest theological society of its kind with nearly 1,800 members worldwide. Most of all, he was a close friend and colleague of Father Doran. So there's no one better in the world to offer this masterclass presentation, Reaching Up to the Mind of Lonergan, the contribution of Robert Doran. Professor Dedowski.
Thank you. Chris, you're the only one I can see. You can hear me okay? And you can see the PowerPoint that I'm sharing. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for this invitation, Louis, and thank you all for your interest in Lonergan and carrying the flame to subsequent generations. I'm just going to give an overview of Bob's intellectual career. Can't think of a better thing to do at 3:30 or 4:30 in the afternoon on a Saturday. Bernard Lonergan once declared that he spent 11 years reaching to the mind of Thomas Aquinas, and it was the reaching that changed him. In 1968, at the age of 29, as a young Jesuit, Robert Doran encountered the thought of Bernard Lonergan for the first time. He read Lonergan's tome Insight, a study of human understanding, during that summer. His search for an intellectual mentor was over, and he would never look back. But what compelled him in Lonergan's thought was a look forward with a vision to what Catholic theology should aspire to be, intellectually rigorous, rooted in both the old and the new. Doran was to spend more than the next half a century of his life unabashedly and unwaveringly teaching, researching, writing, editing, commentating, establishing institutions, and creatively developing Lonergan's thought. In addition to being one of Lonergan's most faithful proteges, Doran was arguably the most knowledgeable of Lonergan's thought for his time, the most prolific, and in Lonergan's own words, the most creative. The purpose of this talk is to briefly survey Doran's intellectual achievements in order to foster appreciation for his work as a Catholic theologian, but also to place it in a summative context for those who wish to study his work or simply appreciate his contributions to Lonergan's studies. Previously, I have suggested a division of Doran's intellectual career into 3 major movements: the appropriation of Lonergan's thought to depth psychology, the attempt to integrate theology into history, the attempt to begin a collaborative, comprehensive, systematic theology for our time. Regarding the first, he laid the groundwork in his doctoral dissertation research that culminated in his subsequent tome, Theology and the Dialectics of History, henceforth referred to as TDH, especially in chapter 6 of that volume. As well, the majority of TDH is his attempt to lay out the outlines of an integration of theology into history. The third movement begins with his exploration of a key aspect of Lonergan's systematic theology, which in turn inspires him toward a collaborative vision and his own unfinished trilogy, The Trinity in History. But along the way, Doran makes some key hermeneutic breakthroughs for understanding Lonergan's thought. In this talk, I will be focusing on Doran's intellectual developments, which can be divided into 4 areas. 1, the early work up to his tome TDH. 2, the turn to systematic theology. 3, the implementation of the systematics. And 4, other hermeneutic innovations of Lonergan's thought. The first 3 are chronological, but I will also point out the 4th, key innovations of Lonergan's thought as I go along. Psychological self-appropriation. Doran's intellectual formation culminated in his doctoral studies at Marquette University, which he completed in 1975. His dissertation was published as Subject and Psyche, Ricoeur, Jung, and the Search for Foundations in 1977. It is weighty as dissertations go, engaging thinkers as erudite and deep as Ricoeur, Jung, Heidegger, and Lonergan. The dissertation is important because Doran has effectively developed the notion of psychic conversion as a 4th conversion to Lonergan's threefold conversions: intellectual, moral, and religious. Lonergan was later to explicitly write, quote, "To these, Doran has added a psychic conversion in his book on psychic conversion and theological foundations. He has thought the matter through thoroughly, and it fits very adroitly and snugly into my own efforts." Moreover, the dissertation is significant because one realizes that in his discovery of Lonergan, Doran believes he has found a key to the critical appropriation of the subject. Quote, and this is from Doran, "For I knew then that there was a further dimension to the foundational domain of the existential subject, that which had been cleared by Lonergan, that this domain was time, the imaginally instituted horizon of the psychic dimension of interiority." End quote. And while Heidegger and Jung had made headway along these lines, it still required what Doran stated as a sublation of depth psychological phenomenon into a foundational quest gilded by Lonergan in the archaeological, teleological unity and tension of a living symbol process, thus providing an inner space correlated with primordial time. That is an end quote. I know you all miss Doran's prose. This attempt to articulate the symbolic depths of psychic interiority would have a further role to play in systematic theology, which occasioned Doran's engagement with Balthasar and even further with the work of René Girard. But this dissertation also hinted at a recovery of the feminine archetype. Although Doran acknowledged its loss in Western thought, he never pursued it further. Third, the dissertation sets Doran on an intellectual trajectory, with one of the goals being a critical reading of Jung in a manner in which Paul Ricoeur did of Freud. In the latter work on Freud, Ricoeur attempted an archaeological recovery of symbolism in Freud, while for Doran, following Lonergan's suggestion, Jung offered a teleological approach. Doran would attempt a more comprehensive engagement with Jung in his TDH. Having established the basis for psychic conversion in his dissertation, in his next book, Doran concentrated singly on psychic conversion and its role in theological foundations. Psychic conversion and theological foundations, he quote, synthesizes and consolidates in a systematic fashion my thoughts on psychic conversion, end quote. The operation of psychic conversion is at the first level and heals dramatic bias. Here, Doran is harking back to Lonergan's reliance on the psychoanalytical work of Wilhelm Steckel in chapter 6 of Insight, The reference is to scotoma, the blind spot, that can affect the other levels of consciousness, leading to a scotosis. Doran has in mind that psychic conversion heals the scotoma or blind spot, consequently allowing intentional consciousness access to images that might otherwise be repressed. Operative throughout Doran's thinking at this time is the influence of Lewis Mumford's call for a world cultural humanity. Doran also begins to distinguish the cosmological, anthropological, and soteriological views of history, which will later be expanded upon in TDH. His intention in psychic conversion is, one, to continue integrating the psychological self-appropriation of the subject within Lonergan's threefold notion of conversion as the foundations of theology. Two, to promote a reorientation of the sciences to include the human being's orientation towards transcendence. And three, to promote interdisciplinary collaboration. His reservations concerning some of Carl Jung's theologizing began to come to the fore as well. TDH. Over the course of the next 10 years, Doran was to complete his tome, Theology and the Dialectics of History, 1990. Therein, he sought to work out the foundations for an integration of theology and history following Lonergan's lead. In many ways, one can say that TDH is Doran's ambitious extrapolation of chapters 6 and 7 of Lonergan's Insight, the chapters that deal with common sense as subject and as object, respectively. A synopsis of TDH would take us beyond the scope of this talk, and especially that it's 800 pages, nearly. We will have to content ourselves with some of the specific achievements of that dense work. There are three specific areas Doran develops, at least that I'm highlighting. One, a development of Lonergan's notion of dialectic, both in terms of a dialectic of contraries and one of contradictories, as well as Doran's own proposal for a third dialectic of culture. Two, couched within the notion of dialectic of the subject is Doran's own development of psychic conversion as a transformation of the repressive censor so that the images are released for insight. And three, Doran also discovers a hermeneutic key by correlating Lonergan's levels of consciousness with the preferential scale of values from method and theology. And four, he brings the three dialectics of the subject, the community, and culture, and correlates them respectively with personal, social, and cultural values. Together, these dialectics and corresponding values form part of the upper blade for a theory of history from which theology can draw. I will elaborate on each of these 4 points briefly, taking the preferential scales of values first. Doran developed Lonergan's preferential scale of values, vital, social, cultural, personal, and religious, in such a way as to provide a critique of Marxism on the one hand and unbridled capitalism on the other hand. His work on chapter 4 is rich with insights and worthy of further study, but I will focus on a hermeneutic connection Doran was able to make, wherein he filled in a gap of which Lonergan would have likely had agreed by correlating the preferential scale of values with each of the levels of consciousness, as you see on the screen. He states, quote, "The relations among the levels of value are isomorphic with those among the levels of consciousness to which the levels of value respectively correspond. This effectively means that the levels of consciousness correspond with respective levels in the scale of values." The precedent for the development comes from Lonergan's treatment of the good in Topics in Education, where Lonergan correlates in his early structure of the good, particular goods, good of order, and value, with the levels of experience, understanding, and judgment, respectively. Albeit this is an early formulation of his notion of the good, it at least suggests Lonergan's readiness to ground the structure of the good with the levels of consciousness. The hermeneutic value of Doran's development is that it brings Lonergan's levels of consciousness together with the preferential scale in order to solidify further developments, as Doran demonstrates in section 2 of chapter 4 of TDH. Without this correlation and isomorphism between the levels in the scale of values, Doran opines that the scale remains abstract, static, and conceptualistic. Secondly, Doran develops Lonergan's notion of dialectic by expanding it to a dialectic of contraries and a dialectic of contradictories. In Lonergan's notion of dialectic, he distinguishes between complementary, contradictory, or you can call them dialectical, and then genetic differences. Complementary differences are differences that form a higher integrative whole, or contradictory or dialectical differences are mutually irreconcilable, and genetic differences pertain to different sequences of development. Doran's development distinguishes further between a dialectic of contraries and that of contradictories. The context of this development had to do with Doran's personal history with Jungian analysis and his thinking through some of Jung's theological claims. The problem comes in the fact that the coincidentia oppositorum, or the coinciding of opposites, does not always afford a distinction between the coinciding of complementary differences and that of contradictory differences. Light and darkness are contraries in the work of art. By contrast, good and evil are contradictories that cannot form a higher synthesis. When Jung suggested that God has a shadow side, this contradicted God's benevolence and omniscience. Doran's development of these two dialectics allowed for a critical appropriation of Jung's theory, and it formed a key part of his argument for a reorientation of depth psychology. The dialectic of culture. Doran developed a notion of a dialectic of culture to complement Lonergan's development of the dialectic of subject and dialectic of community. The dialectic of the subject pertains to the individual's struggle between authenticity and inauthenticity, between the commitment to self-transcendence and the blocks of bias or the flight from understanding, truth, reality, and goodness. It is with this dialectic that psychic conversion can heal blocks to sensitivity that would otherwise impede one's ability to be fully attentive to one's experience. The dialectic of community reflects the tension within groups or communities between civil and spontaneous interpersonal relations on the one hand, and the practicality and efficiency in a group on the other hand. By a dialectic of culture, Doran means, quote, that any culture is a more or less integral or distorted play of forces emergent from opposed but linked principles of cosmological and anthropological constitutive meaning, end quote. Building on his previous insight, Doran emphasizes that each of these three dialectics are dialectics of contraries, ideally, by which he means either or, but not either or, but of both and. That's a quote from him. The soteriological constitutive meaning, emerging from the Judeo-Christian tradition, holds the promise for Doran of an integrative function to this dialectic of culture. He develops the dialectic of culture based on a distinction from Eric Voegelin. Specifically, the dialectic of culture comprises a tension between the cosmological worldview of cycles, seasons, rhythms, linked closely to nature, rituals, and sacred geography on the one hand, and the anthropological, and I would say primarily Western anthropological worldview on the other hand. A distortion occurs when we overemphasize one of the poles. The current questions around climate change, for example, suggest an overemphasis on the anthropological principle. Doran explains the distortions in the dialectic of culture in the following way, and I'll read a quote from him. An exclusively cosmological set of constitutive meanings informs a culture that is not only dominated by myth and magic, but also powerless against oppressive forces of contemporary imperialistic or totalitarian ambition. And when anthropological constitutive meaning informs the way of life of the community at the expense of the cosmological attunement to the rhythms and processes of the body and of non-human nature, the very intentionality of the anthropological breakthrough to a world-transcendent measure of integrity is canceled by human pride, end quote. An overemphasis on the anthropological leads to claiming too much for human capabilities and a dismissal of transcendent value. Likewise, an overemphasis on the cosmological leads to a passivity and resignation to the forces of nature and the reliance on myth for the explanation of phenomena. Certainly, this dialectic, as Doran articulates it, occasions a further discussion of current tensions in post-colonial theory. Such implications remain to be further studied. In TDH, Doran is complexifying the statement Lonergan makes at the outset of Method and Theology, that theology mediates between a religion and culture. With respect to the theme, to the chief aims of TDH, once Doran has the three dialectics established of the subject, of the community, and of the culture, he complexifies the role of mediation between culture and religion. It is systematic theology's function, he states, to articulate soteriological constitutive meaning in an asymptotically explanatory and so analogical form in such a way as to mediate it with the constitutive meanings that effectively inform the contemporary cultural situation at any given time, end quote. Hence, the three dialectics as instantiated in time and space make up the situation that theology must engage within history. Doran combines the three dialectics with the scale of values so that he correlates the dialectic of the subject with personal value, that of community with social values, and the dialectic of culture with cultural values. These, along with psychic conversion, complement Lonergan's own efforts as a methodological prolegomenon to a Catholic systematic theology at the level of our times. Shifting gears here. Between the interim of the publication of TDH in 1990 and the publication of his next book, What is Systematic Theology, in 2006, there were key developments that would impel Doran towards the next and final lengthy stage of his career, his own attempt at a Catholic systematic theology. These years included his engagement with Hans Urs von Balthasar and an attempt at a rapprochement, not so much between Lonergan and Balthasar per se, but rather between the camps that formed around them, namely due to Balthasar's criticisms of Rahner and therefore any Thomistic project along the lines that Lonergan would have been favorable to. Doran was convinced the division had its roots in the divergence between Bonaventure and Aquinas. He had also discovered the work of René Girard and began to bring key aspects from his theories of violence into dialogue with his own thinking about Lonergan's theology. Later, when he was editing the Christological works of Lonergan, Doran would revisit Lonergan's engagement with Anselm in order to bring Girard's ideas together with Lonergan's notion of the law of the cross. But what really caught Doran's attention during this time, as a result of editing Lonergan's Triune God Systematics, Collected Works 12, towards the end of that book, Lonergan, excuse me, Lonergan puts forth what has since been labeled the Nexus Mysteriortum, or some also call it the four-point hypothesis. That's the more common use, so I'll use that. The paragraph of the four-point hypothesis can be found near the end of Lonergan's two-volume treatise on the Trinity. According to Doran, therein lies the keys for unlocking the future of systematic theology. He believed the four-point hypothesis was to do for systematic theology what the periodic table did for chemistry. It was accumulation of explanatory theological insights that would provide a starting point for a collaborative systematic theology for our time. Doran labored to begin writing a systematic theology from the standpoint of a third stage of meaning. The third stage of meaning is the stage where method becomes grounded in human interiority, where the diverse worlds of common sense and theory are related to one another in terms of human consciousness. It is also the stage that is grounded in a religiously differentiated consciousness. The book, What is Systematic Theology, was to become the hinge between his early work in TDH and his later attempt at a trilogy, The Trinity in History. WIST, as you may want to call it, is less a commentary on Lonergan's work and more Doran's embarking on his own initiative to implement Lonergan's notion of systematics. It lays the foreground for such an endeavor. The goal of systematics for Lonergan is to understand in a coherent, ordered manner the mysteries of the faith as affirmed in doctrines insofar as those can be understood. It aims at a systematic synthesis that also meets the signs of the times. It is a tall order, and while Aquinas' Summa may have been the chief historical example of such a synthesis, Doran is adamant that anything approximating that medieval ideal will be a collaborative exercise. But Lonergan's chapter on systematics and method in theology is underwritten. No doubt Lonergan presumed future commentators would take his earlier thoughts on systematics into account. As such, Doran's reliance on the paragraph from Lonergan's Trinitarian treatise became a key component in how Doran began implementing a Lonerganian-inspired systematic theology. Doran states, quote, "It is my suggestion that functional specialization, mediation, and the new notion of foundations call for an accumulation of insights, adjustments, and reinterpretations around the notion of systematics that do not find their way into the chapter on the functional specialty systematics in method and theology." What is systematic theology lays the final methodological groundwork before Doran's own attempt at a Trinitarian systematics. But before he could do that, he first needed to, one, clarify Lonergan's own attempts at systematics, and two, clarify some of his own attempts to nuance and develop Lonergan's position on systematics and issues arising from method and theology. I will not be able to rehearse those here other than to mention some of the key points. First, since systematics aims at a synthetic understanding of the mysteries of the faith as revealed, by its very nature, it will be imperfect, analogous, and so its explanations will differ from the explanations of the other sciences. One of the key points Doran raises is whether systematics as explanatory, typically a theoretical and abstract endeavor, can somehow take into account the aesthetic, dramatic, narrative accounts of topics under its purview. Namely, he has in mind in expressing the mystery of the redemption. Second, he clarifies specifically what dogmas fall under the purview of systematics, or more accurately, he opens it up. Lonergan's notion of doctrines and method is broader than just dogmatic pronouncements, as many of you know. Doran follows Lonergan's adherence to Vatican I's definition of dogmas as expressions of mysteries hidden in the inner life of God, divinely revealed. However, he qualifies that some of those mysteries, one, are not explicitly pronounced, but nevertheless fall under the purview of dogmas, such as the redemption. There's a reason, by the way, that Doran is emphasizing redemption, because that would have been the final volume of his Trinity. His Trinitarian theology. Secondly, he continues with the question that symbolic, dramatic, narrative expressions can also express an understanding of the mysteries, and ask whether there is a role for those in systematic theology. Third, he continues his argument that there are theological doctrines that are not ecclesiastical, but methodological starting points for systematic theologians based on the prior achievements of others. He mentions 3 examples. 1, Aquinas' distinction between operative and cooperative grace. 2, the Trinitarian psychological analogy. And 3, the preferential option for the poor. Fourth, Doran argues that the mediation theology effects between religion and culture is one of mutual self-mediation, a two-way rather than a one-way or strict self-mediation. This latter point was implicit in Lonergan, but needed to be clarified and has since been so. Fifth, the structure or starting point for contemporary systematics will be the 4-point hypothesis, but this will need to be complemented by a theory of history grounded in Lonergan's theory of consciousness, history, and Doran's own work from TDH that brings the scale of values and the 3 dialectics to bear upon that theory of history. 6. Doran exercises creative hermeneutics in resolving a question for scholars as to the difference between Lonergan's statement on ethics and insight versus his later one in method. In short, the latter text incorporates feeling and value, whereas the former views an ethical decision as an act of rational compilation. For Doran, a rational grasp of value and insight is analogous to the 3rd time of election in Ignatius' spiritual exercises. By contrast, the 1st and 2nd times of election are accounted for in Chapter 2 of Method and Theology, when one immediately grasps the good unquestionably in one's feelings, as in the 1st time of election, and the discernment about the values over satisfaction in the 2nd time of election. The 2nd time of election also essentially encapsulates Lonergan's notion of moral conversion. So if you're stuck on the 2nd time of election, it may signal the need for a moral conversion of some degree. 7. Whereas Lonergan spoke of 4 levels of intentional consciousness, experience, presentations, understanding, judgment, and decision, Doran argued for the feasibility of 6 levels, a phrase Lonergan himself used. However, at the first level of dream consciousness, it's inchoate and not intentional in the same way as the 4 basic levels. There is also the reality of falling in love, sometimes called a 5th level, but in this context, it would be the 6th. Doran had raised the question of the significance of being in love as a level of consciousness, and there's been a lot of discussion around this 5th level of falling in love. It is not necessary to review that here, as it's been addressed by many other scholars, and especially Jeremy Blackwood's book on that, which summarizes it all nice and succinctly. However, it is important that it be considered not as a level of intentional consciousness per se, but more as a state or an orientation, the entire intentional structure, and requires a genuine commitment. It is a 4th level on the one hand because of personal and religious values are objects of the 4th level, but on the other hand, it's more than that because it establishes a horizon from which subsequent choices flow. As a matter of fact, Doran emphasizes that the two additional levels, dreaming and being in love, are non-intentional, while the other four, the common ones, which form the basis of Lonergan's philosophy, are intentional. Eighth, based on some key texts by Lonergan, Doran argues for development of the first level experience presentations. He argues that it is not just raw data for sensitivity, as initially thought, simply presented to the senses. Rather, some of the data comes to us already patterned as rudimentary insights. This should not seem scandalous if we consider Lonergan's quote from Method and Theology, quote, "One's senses can become merely an apparatus for receiving and transmitting signals. At the red light, the brake goes on. At the green light, the accelerator is pressed down. So there results the behavior of the ready-made subject in a ready-made world," end quote. Doran attempts a rapprochement between Lonergan and Wittgenstein by distinguishing, as Lonergan does, between ordinary and original meaningfulness. Original meaningfulness embodies insights as immanently generated knowledge, while ordinary meaningfulness embodies the insights of the common fund of knowledge in a specific context. Moreover, Doran argues for a rapprochement with Heidegger in that these insights or ordinary meanings that come to us patterned at the first level and comprise what the German philosopher meant by Verstehen. That's Doran's argument. Doran would interpret Verstehen to mean those data that come to us preconceptually but are patterned as meaning. So I don't think about it being a stoplight, I just react. He suggests the distinction between minor formal and actual intelligibility. The former would specifically refer to Verstehen, the latter to what Lonergan refers to knowledge as belief, as described by Lonergan in select passages of Insight and Method. Lonergan tended to emphasize original meaningfulness, but both original and ordinary meaningfulness are necessary for a fuller account of human knowledge and action. Ninth, Doran anticipates a theory of social grace based on his reading of Lonergan's essay, Natural Right and Historical Mindedness. This also derives from Lonergan's reference to a state of grace in his Trinitarian theology, quote, "Not as an individual habit," Doran explains, "but as a social situation, as an intercommunion of the three divine subjects," end quote. Such a notion of social grace would correspond and respond to the more recent development of social sin. To sum up, what is systematic theology? A systematic theology at the level of our time will derive its basic categories from interiorly and religiously differentiated consciousness, and it will be grounded in history. Doran sees the key to linking it to history in the two divine missions. Systematic theology will take the form of an explanatory view of history, a Heilsgeschichte, although Doran does not invoke the term, a notion of salvation history. I will quote from Doran here, "The combination of the four-point hypothesis with the theory of history thus enables us to relate Trinitarian theology and even the theology of the immanent Trinity directly to the process not only of the individual sanctification, but also of the human historical unfolding. The discernment of the mission of the Holy Spirit thus becomes the most important ingredient in humankind's taking responsibility for the guidance of history," end quote. As I come to my conclusion, I'm just going to say something about the trilogy on the Trinity and history. Time does not permit an exploration of Doran's actual attempt at a systematic theology he envisioned in his unfinished trilogy. On the one hand, Doran's vision of theology calls for collaboration. On the other hand, it is as if he decided to initiate perhaps a cornerstone of the project single-handedly with his trilogy, The Trinity in History. Hence, Doran focuses on his own development of the four-point hypothesis, focusing on two relations: active spiration, the Father and Son as one principle breathing the Holy Spirit, and passive spiration, the Holy Spirit as breathed. The missions of the Son and the Spirit are the extensions of the two divine processions with externally created terms. The created term for active spiration is sanctifying grace. The created term for passive spiration is charity. It should be noted that there is a basis for a mystical theology as well. Here I'm just a footnote to Doran's work, in that with the habit of charity, when the graced human beings carry out loving acts, they are participating in the relation of passive spiration and therefore loving the Father and the Son as the Holy Spirit loves them. This would give meaning to the biblical text, "Whatsoever you do to the least of these, you do unto me." In the first volume of the Trinity in History, Missions and Processions, Doran focuses on the mission of the Holy Spirit. Here he takes Frederick Crow's insight into the universal mission of the Holy Spirit as a major premise. This effectively means that the dialogue with the religions of the world will be construed in their authentic manifestations as fruits of the Spirit, as he will articulate in terms of the invisible mission of the Holy Spirit. Of course, that doesn't preclude the seeds of the Word as well, but he's working on the Holy Spirit in the first volume. He hypothesizes a psychological analogy of memoria, returning to Augustine, memoria, faith, and charity, as analogous to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, respectively. The second volume of the Trinity in History shifts its emphasis from fleshing out the implications between the processions and the missions to that of the relations and persons. It incorporates the incarnation, or the visible and invisible missions of the Son, with previous emphases. At this point, Doran's engagement with the work of Girard factors into a clarification of the meaning of participation to specify imitation, so that participation in the divine missions is also an elevated positive imitation of them as well. As such, it is a counter to the negative imitation and mimesis that Girard associates with his analysis of human sin and violence. With the second volume, Doran is raising some novel questions and taking the conversation further, as with queries about the relations among the created external terms and how this would be articulated in terms of a theology of social grace. Among other developments, Doran argues that the invisible, more suggest that the invisible mission of the Son corresponds to a graced knowledge of truth, and the invisible mission of the Spirit corresponds to a graced act of benevolence. The third uncompleted volume, titled Redeeming History, aimed to complete a circle in Doran's academic endeavors begun in TDH. It was slated to address soteriology and redemption as the implications of this in history. One can assume that where Doran was formulating the notion of a socially graced community as manifesting the reign of God, Volume 3 would have articulated that more explicitly in eschatological terms. We can also assume he would have addressed the unknown person of the Father, of whom the Word reveals. The question of the beatific vision would likely have been approached in this final volume, which was perhaps ironically cut short by Doran's death in January of 2021. Finally, after completing the editing of volume 25 of Collected Works in 2019, which, by the way, I co-edited with him, which makes that 4 volumes, Doran revisited an earlier thesis of his concerning reception on the topic of premotion. The lengthy technical essay is to be published, if not already, in Method Journal of Lonergan Studies. Doran mentioned to me several times during the months before he died that he considered it the best thing he's ever written. Concluding comment. If one were to summarize Doran's achievements, standing on one foot, one would see his achievements in several major areas. 1. He filled out key aspects of Lonergan's philosophical and religious foundations. 2. As Lonergan has distinguished between being conscious in two ways, receptively and actively, Doran began to fill out the foundations for the receptive way of being conscious, as preconceptual meanings and as the aesthetic dramatic, along with the role of psychic conversion in those processes. 3, he began to ensure the praxis of systematic theology by insisting on the incorporation of the preferential option for the poor and the marginalized. And 4, in his final works, he began laying the cornerstone for a Catholic systematic theology to meet the exigencies of our time. Doran will undoubtedly become known as one of the principal commentators and innovators of Lonergan's thought. His vision and labor for what systematic theology could be reflect his own eminently generated and creative contributions to this endeavor. Still, Doran is not easily accessible even to the educated reader, and he is unapologetically so. Therefore, those who reach up to the mind of Lonergan will also have to reach up to the mind of Doran, but there is value in the reaching. Thank you.
John, thank you very much. Thank you. I mean, just your personal touch. You made this Saturday afternoon truly enjoyable and enriching for us all. So thank you, and bringing back and bringing into fruition Doran's work here.
Thank you.
So thank you. Any comments, questions, any thoughts that people have, reflections about this? We have a few minutes of conversation.
Chris, I can only see you, so you'll have to field the, you'll have to pick them.
Okay, yeah. Peter, you have a question. You want to go ahead?
Yes. The apostles were worried when Jesus said he was going to leave them. But he said to them that it's in your interest, because if I don't go, the Holy Spirit won't come. The gift won't come. Now, the early church was very much about the gift of the Holy Spirit. Now, I'm wondering if Father Doran, in the 4-point hypothesis, had any explanation for this.
Have you read the red volume?
No, I read what he wrote about the Trinity.
Yeah.
What's that called?
Towards the end of this volume, the second volume on Trinity and history, he engages extensively in the Jesus research with Meyer and Wright, and I would refer you to study that in that volume.
Thank you.
Patrick?
It's not a question at all. It's just very much a thank you for presenting such a great summary and also delineation of Doran's work. So thank you, John.
Thank you.
Julie, you have a question. Thought.
Yeah, hi, John. Thank you so much for your presentation. This is just a wonderful tribute to your friend and mentor, so thank you for the overview. So my question is, you went through this in Doran's work covering psychic conversion and just the role of symbols in psychic conversion and images that need to be uplifted and need to be liberated. They need to come through beyond this repressive censorship psychically, right? So I'm just kind of wondering, in your opinion, where the world is now. I realize this is a really big question, but where the world is now, where different cultures are now, if you can even answer that, what images do you think need to become more healed psychically? Like in terms of symbols and images, where would you go?
What images?
Yeah.
Wow. First, there's a lot of division in the world. There's a lot of division in the Roman Catholic Church. There's a lot of division in the United States, which has negative effects on the rest of the world and can also be exploited by the enemies of the United States. This is going to be a little bit quirky, but one of the things I puzzle about is why everybody seems to like musicians. You hardly meet someone that doesn't like a musician. So maybe we need some kind of mystical musicians to bring some kind of higher unitive presence throughout the world. The second thing I would point to is the thing that Doran suggested early on, which in a recent article, which you know about because your dissertation is cited in it, excellent dissertation, by the way, is the recovery of the feminine. To me, that's a big that's as significant as I wrote in that essay. It's significant as what Balthasar called the loss of beauty. And perhaps even more are unaware of the significance of the loss of the feminine than they are of beauty.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much for all of that. Just a quick note of affirmation. So I'm assigning to my seminarians some of Father Norris Clark's work, the Aquinas lecture from 1993 on person and being, and it's very much inspired by Lonergan. So he talks about the sun as the within the inner Trinity as the archetypal symbol of receptivity. And I wonder how that could connect eventually to the sacred feminine. And I think I would like to lift up receptivity and a spirituality of deep listening, because it seems like some of the difficulty is people struggle to listen to one another at a deep level. And so it's interesting that you bring up the picture of music, as something to be listened to deeply and enjoyed, rather than something just in the background or package. So I know that's kind of just neither here nor there, but thank you so much for your answer and for your presentation. I really appreciated both.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, John. And I have a question regarding psychic conversion. This, from my understanding, is what Doran would want us to accept as the fourth level of conversion, Lonergan. I know also that there are other candidates as to what would be the fourth level. Of course, there is Bernard Tyrrell's psychological conversion and Donald Gelpy's affective conversion. I know you are very vast in all of this. So if you could say a word as to, is there really a difference between psychic conversion and affective conversion? And if that is true, what would you say is the main difference here?
Well, oftentimes first of all, Joseph Agbanaya and some others have a volume coming out on psychic conversion. I'm republishing an article in there where I investigate Tyrrell's and Doran's, I compare and contrast them. And at the end, I argue for an Occam's razor when it comes to conversions. That said, I think affectivity can be blocked. That block can be linked to a repressed image. Oftentimes, it's not just the images that are repressed, but it's the feelings. Traditional psychoanalysis would focus on catharsis. I think sometimes the term affective conversion is overrated in the Lonergan. It's overstated in the Lonergan community. He was speaking to a philosophical community, and he was prescinding from speaking about theology or God explicitly. So he construed affective conversion as falling in love, and he wasn't differentiating there between human beings and God as clearly as he does in other locations. So I think affective conversion was is not as does not give a license necessarily for a fourth conversion. That said, any dramatic healing of dramatic bias is going to give way to affective conversion, and a liberation and transformation of one's affectivity. And all along the line, anytime there's a healing and a block in development, which is what a conversion is, there's going to be an effective liberation with that as well. So I tend to see effective conversion as kind of more of a fruit than an actual conversion.
Steve, you want to go ahead?
Yeah. Hey, John, this is Steve Calmy. Thanks so much for your great just explanation and really great overview of Doran's academic work. And yeah, just beautiful. I'm curious, I liked your title a lot, this idea of reaching up to the mind of, but it leaves me with quite a bit of intimidation. And I have a feeling a lot of people feel that in terms of getting through Doran's work requires both essentially reaching up to the mind of Lonergan and then reaching up to the mind of Doran, like you said. And that kind of intense depth of focus on, two particular scholars strikes me as something that is less and less common and less interested in today, as we, I think, importantly look at interdisciplinary things and, as Doran did, as you do, draw in all these different people. And I'm wondering if you have any comments on how do we get to that depth of understanding of those great and complicated minds like Lonergan and Doran without being overly intimidated by this, what feels like a 20-year process just to get to a baseline of understanding sometimes. Just if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's like I say to my students, on the one hand, Lonergan is not for everybody. And on the other hand, Lonergan is for everybody, right? Because we all have this dialectic of authenticity and inauthenticity. I don't think everybody's called to do Lonergan and Doran studies. Like not everybody's called to do Thomism or to study Thomas. But those who are called, you're just gonna have to put into work, and that's how things are developed. I can't develop Lonergan and Doran unless I know it. I think we also need a generation of communicators, which some of the communicators are on this call right now. I can't, for some reason, I've lost ability to see who's online, but that will help too. But what's really going to make the difference in Catholic theology is when we get a pope that likes Bernard Lonergan, then that's going to put it into the mainstream. People will do the work, just like they did the work for the angelic doctor after Leo raised him up. I'm not suggesting that Lonergan is going to be mentioned in a papal encyclical, but even Pope Francis's connection with Gardini has been enough to lift his profile. So eventually it's going to become mainstream. I've always felt that way, and I bet the bank on it, and I haven't been disappointed yet. But it's not in our hands either, you know. That's history, and certainly it's going to be collaborative in a way that it hasn't been before. Does that help, Steve?
Yeah. Thanks, John. I appreciate that. I like that idea of that's I hadn't thought about that, but the idea of the papal theology kind of and the impact that can have. So yeah, great. Thank you.
Catherine, you ever thought? I think you're still muted if you want to talk.
Are we on? We're on? Okay. Any way we can get Lonergan's work in some way into Catholic education? I've tried to do that a couple of times and been closed down. I don't know why. You have to ask people who did it to find out why. But somebody needs to do that if they're not doing it already. Get Lonergan's work and translate it into part of the way to do that also is to recognize what's already out there in children's literature, in children's films, to recognize what's transcendent and what we mean by that, self-transcendent, in those things already, because they're already there. Two of the things that I wanted to refer to that are particularly about releasing images, which came up in the earlier question, was Robert Cole's, his work. I don't know if you all are familiar with him, Spiritual Life of Children, okay? And by the way, he has a work, I think, on Bruce Springsteen and his music, I'm pretty sure. The other one is the much maligned Bruno Bettelheim, who, regardless of what you say about him and his psychology, he wrote really what should be a classic work called The Uses of Enchantment. And in the first part of that book, the second part too, but the first part, it is absolutely a profoundly written book and speaks exactly to what goes on in childhood stories, and mythology and all that, and what goes on, what is the use of that kind of enchantment, that sense of a child's development. Of course, we lose a lot of that in our emphasis in the West, especially Western education, on systematics and science and STEM. You've heard of STEM? Everybody here heard of STEM? Science, technology, so forth. Anyway.
So was your question about religious education?
Yeah, religious education. We need to do something about bringing Lonergan's work systematically into Catholic education. I mean, other education too, but.
Yeah, there was
there are parts of that going on here and there, but.
Yeah, one of my doctoral students in Toronto, she did a DMin on trying to bring it into catechetical instructors. Right. But that's complicated. I think the best thing to do is to be an authentic person and try to teach people to be attentive, intelligent, reasonable, responsible. I also think there's a lot of demythologization that needs to happen in Catholic religious education. And, the climate isn't always disposed to that, depending where you're at.
No, but I always try to throw that out.
I don't have the answers for you, Catherine, but keep up the good work.
Well, so far we just have to, and this speaks to your earlier problem with, bringing Catholicism to the world. Sometimes we just have to rely on our example and let Paul fall off his horse of his own accord. So. So, and gods, by the way. But I do think that the Catholic education really needs a systematic element that's involved with Lonergan's work. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Really enjoyed your talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree, John. I presented at this conference about 10 years ago on teaching Lonergan to high school students, and it's like that we can all learn to grow in being intelligent and reasonable, responsible, and loving. And so it's like this is universal, and it can be taken to the students, to all people. I just a question for you though, John. I'm wondering, you brought up how Doran got into, especially the third stage of election in the Ignatian spiritual exercises, and especially, and I remember him talking to that a lot about that. There's that importance when the soul is in tranquilitas, and how there's that calm that allows for a greater receptivity and openness, or moves us into the intelligence then to then make an intelligent responsible decision. I guess I'm wondering, like, how much more, like, there's that James Conner who did that that whole book on like the spiritual exercises in Bernard Lonergan. Is there enough to do to like bring in like a Doran and the spiritual exercises, and bring in some of his ideas, or it's like bring together many of his ideas in an integration with the spiritual exercises?
Well, that's a great question. And by the way, I did the full-blown spiritual exercises in 2004, and I did a third time of election. And I can say it works. There's something that was, Ignatius was a genius. He was a psychologist on fourth level operations. And so for us Lonergan people, we were always like, love insight. We don't want to abandon this chapter 18 of insight ethics. And so when Doran mentioned that, I think it was heartening for me, because I didn't have to choose either or. I could say, okay, this gives it a context. Now that said, as I was preparing this paper, it occurred to me that memoria, which is Doran wants to develop this notion of memoria, and that really, and he suggested, but you could probably write on that, follow it up, Chris, and exploring that as an Ignatian theme, maybe at the first level, and moving one towards an election at the fourth level. That recollection, remembering of God's grace in our lives, it's such a big part of the early part of the exercises. So that might be where I want to go. If you wanted to take it.
Yeah, fascinating. I know. I mean, he even then was connecting memoria with Augustine, and I mean, like and how Augustine brought up like the whole Trinity through that, to the intellectual metaphor that he was getting in that. But that's interesting, connecting it with Ignatius and the spiritual exercises then too. Thank you.
And I think one of those Doran makes, yeah. I think you're welcome.
Any other thoughts, comments, ideas here?
We can go to Debbie. It's fine with me.
Hey, Joseph, yeah, please. Do you want to add some thoughts? Just kind of a.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John. For the interest of everybody here, John was my dissertation director and my teacher. So I passed through him, and I can attest to the flow of his thoughts, as well as his personal relationship with Bob. So thank you so much, John, for being here today. It is really memorable. Thank you. And my question is, I'm asking this question as a student to his teacher, and it is on dialectic of culture. One of the aspects of Bob's work in TDH that I find a little bit difficult to explain to my students is cosmological and anthropological culture, and then the soteriological principle. It's not that it doesn't make sense, but I'm not able to weave together what he was getting at there, even though he gave series of examples. The example that often comes to mind is indigenous culture and then Western culture. But how soteriological principle is almost like a solution that would hold both in tension is what I find a little bit difficult. So I'm wondering whether you can shed some light on that.
Well, I can tell you I have the same question that you do. And part of it is because so much of the soteriological constitutive meaning has come from the anthropological constitutive meaning, and to the detriment of the cosmological meaning. So I have the same question, although if you go to, for example, the apparition of Our Lady in Rwanda, you know, there's people of color. And so I think, I don't know that the anthropological accounts enough for the enculturation. So, you know, I had conversations with Bob about this. I remember him saying, you know, the soteriological is the mediating, but I think what it does is, and this is delicate because there's a mythologization that occurs when the cosmological cultures engage in the anthropological systems of education. And there's been a lot of post-colonial critique about that. There is, and I've lived in indigenous contexts in various parts of my life, and I can say there is a kind of, we would call it superstition. It's not. It's just a different way of seeing the world, where you can. It's up to you to deal with the fate. If somebody sends you bad medicine, it's up to you to do something about it, and this ceremony can change it. Different from the soteriological. At the same time, the anthropological focuses on the deviation of that is pride. And so you could see where the soteriological would respond to that, if, especially in Bob's Gerardian approach, where the law of the cross obliterates negative mimesis. And as I've argued in my own writings, that pride is a horizontal mimetic attempt to be like God. So you're not competing with other human beings, you're competing with God. So in that sense, you could see it, how the soteriological is a solution. But perhaps maybe think about the law of the cross as the solution to the distortions of both ends of the dialectic. But I want to think more about the dialectical culture as it is, and think more deeply about it, because in Method he talks about there's also, in our age, there's undifferentiated consciousness, which is also a problem. So how does that factor in? And these are things I think we still need to think about.
Thank you.
And by the way, that I will say, since Joseph's on the line, I meant to say it earlier, in his dissertation, he took the lead Doran on linking the scale of values with the level of consciousness, and so why not a structure for a theory of sustainable development? And the significance of that is that when the United States does not recognize religious value of in its theories of development. So Joseph's dissertation, as published, has a lot of influence road for people that want to pick theories of sustainable development that are comprehensive and not just focusing on the lower end of the scale, neglecting the higher end of the scale.
Well, again, thank you. As all these Lonergan on the Edge conferences seem to go, it's that we get a lot of great insights, but we are left with a lot more questions to continue to probe and delve into these deeper ideas for another year. But that's what keeps us on the edge, I guess. So thank you all for contributing, for coming, for participating, for asking the deep questions, and for your interest. And so I guess on behalf of the whole Lonergan Society here at Marquette University, this conference came together through the grace of God and through, I think, some special intercession of Father Doran himself as he guided us. But yeah, but I mean, thank you, John, for giving us this master class. You were a teacher for me through all of Insight, and for even a class on beauty, and you continue to be a great teacher for us all. And yeah, you helped wrap up a fantastic conference here of Lonergan on the Edge 2021. So thank you very much.
Thank you.